The Immortal John Hancock here, and today I'm going to be sharing with you 20 Game Boy games you can play using the Super Game Boy. The Super Game Boy was a great accessory offered in the mid-90s that allowed you to play Game Boy cartridges on your Super Nintendo. But not every game utilized the functions built into this nifty accessory. In today's video, I take 20 Game Boy games and share with you what they offer on the Super Game Boy. So sit back, relax, and I hope you enjoy the video. So here it is. This is my Super Game Boy, something I've had in my collection for over 20 years. Came out in 1994 and allowed various effects to be added to Game Boy games playing on your Super Nintendo. Some of the effects fared better than others. Let's take a look. I get nostalgic hearing that and seeing that introduction to the Super Game Boy. Solar Striker was actually a game that came out before the Super Game Boy, but had a special default palette when you booted it up. And it plays pretty decent. It kind of plays like an alpha mission. And here you can see you can go into the Super Game Boy and change the palette. You can change it back to the original Game Boy look, or the glowing green. Another early classic that had a default palette, Alleyway. It's nice because it differentiates the color of the bricks. I thought it was cool that the Super Game Boy enhanced a few early Game Boy games. It's a lot of fun to play them this way and mess around with the palettes, different colors. Every Game Boy game you can do this to. Next game is Kicks, arcade classic, pretty decent on the Game Boy, offering a limited palette, but it does its job. Still fun to play. I still prefer the Nintendo version over this, but it was fun to see the different color palettes that the Super Game Boy offered. Next up is the old Nintendo Baseball. That's right. I dug this one out just to show that it does have a special default palette, making the field of grass extremely green. This actually was a launch title for the Game Boy, one of 4. And it was nice to go back and revisit this classic. I played this a long time ago, probably back when I was playing Little League. Up next is Madden 97, and it's pretty interesting because for this game, they added additional sound. Pretty cool usage of the Super Game Boy. I thought the background border was pretty cool too. Nice color there. And although, this is not a game you're going to revisit all the time, it's kind of neat to go back with some of these games and see what they tried to do with the Super Game Boy. Nice additional enhancements. I wish they did this with more games. The arcade classics was kind of a mixed bag, but Defender is actually one of the better ones, and it looks great on the Super Game Boy. I like the background. It kind of mimics the look of the arcade classic, even though it doesn't play as good. It's still a decent job using the limited colored palette and background of the arcade cabinet. Pretty sweet. The other game on the 2-pack is Joust, and unfortunately Joust doesn't look as good as Defender. I don't know why that is, unless it was programmed by somebody else and they didn't include it. It's kind of interesting, but it still has a nice arcade background. Another game to check out is Space Invaders, which has a completely different ROM on the actual cartridge. So definitely check that one out too. I don't have it in my collection. Tetris Blast is a Tetris game that is often overlooked, known as Super Bomb Bliss in Japan. This is a variation of Tetris in which you are trying to form bombs on top of clearing rows like classic Tetris gameplay. I had a lot of fun with this one. I didn't play this a lot back in the day. I don't know why. It came out kind of late, 96. But this is definitely a puzzle game I want to revisit. Here's another oddity, Pocket Bomberman, a platformer. And this is one of the Game Boy Color games that also was backwards compatible with the original Game Boy, offering a limited color palette and custom background border. This is a neat game. I need to revisit this. I like platformers such as this. And I haven't played this one that much, and it looks kind of fun, so definitely worth checking out. Kirby's Dreamland, a Game Boy favorite and iconic release. Here it has a nice pink palette custom to when you boot it up with the Super Game Boy. Fantastic game if you haven't checked it out. This is the first Kirby game release. So sweet it will give you a cavity looking. This was one of the first half dozen games in my collection. Next up is Contra Alien Wars, and done by Factor 5. I wouldn't expect anything less. They are an amazing company that do some cool hardware tricks. What they did here is added additional sound to the Game Boy game on the Super Game Boy. Pretty sweet, very difficult game. Definitely worth checking out. Here's another oddity. This is Killer Instinct, and this was a bundle that I have in my collection with a Game Boy. And what's weird about it is that this offers 2-player support just using the second port of the Super Nintendo. Simply just plug in a controller and a second player can play against one another. I think Primal Rage is another one. I personally would just play the Super Nintendo version of Killer Instinct versus this mediocre fighting game on the Game Boy. Next up is Game & Watch Gallery. In fact, all 3 Game & Watch galleries have a cool background and a nice custom palette when you boot it up. These are fantastic games and one of my favorites to play on the Super Game Boy. They look fantastic. You know, I really prefer playing Game Boy on a larger screen. You know, my vision's not the best, and so it's really nice to play these Game Boy games with enhanced features. Link's Awakening is another classic from Nintendo. This is really when Nintendo was hitting their stride. The copy in my collection is actually the Game Boy Color Deluxe version. If you haven't checked this out, I highly recommend going back and revisiting the original, though the Switch version of the game looks amazing. Here's a game in my collection that I haven't played and found out that it actually was produced by Miyamoto himself. And this is a nice game to play on the Super Game Boy. It's got a nice colorful background border as well as a nice palette. This is a fun puzzle game in which you're going around digging and moving various objects. Pokemon Red. This is going to invoke lots of nostalgia for several gamers out there. This looks fantastic on the Super Game Boy. Awesome border as well as color usage for the Super Game Boy. I highly recommend this if you're a Pokemon fan. This is the way to play the original in my opinion. Now, Donkey Kong Land to some is a timeless classic. Though this is hard to recommend because you can just play Donkey Kong Country on your Super Nintendo. So even though Donkey Kong Land has a nice border, I wish it had more additional color options for the actual game. Though it still plays great. Now, Super Mario Land 2 is probably one of the best games on the Game Boy, and it looks great, and I like the usage of color. It's very green here, though you can switch that around using the color palette options of the Super Game Boy. This is fantastic, and one of my favorite side-scrolling 2D Mario games of all time. It's definitely much better than the original, and a lot of fun still to play today. Great for kids. Now, Metroid 2 Return of Samus is one of my all-time favorites, though I have to say I played it on the original Game Boy. The color options here, by default, when you boot it up, are okay. I kind of wish there was a black background. It's easy enough to go in and adjust this. I spent so many hours of this back in the day, and one of my very first Game Boy games that I owned. Now, the number one game to try on the Super Game Boy is Donkey Kong. Donkey Kong was kind of the game that they were promoting the Super Game Boy with. It is still, in my opinion, one of the best Game Boy games to play, and the best way to play it is a Super Game Boy. So check it out. It's got a great color palette. It's got the arcade cabinet background as well as other features. Definitely, this is the way to play it. I wish more Game Boy games took advantage of the Super Game Boy like Donkey Kong did. So there you have it. What do you think? What were the games that you played using the Super Game Boy? There are many other games that utilize functions on this great accessory. I just shared the ones that I had in my collection. Today's video, I utilized physical carts and captured footage using the Super Game Boy on an analog Super NT. Thank you so much for the ongoing positive support. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. Please be safe at this time. This is the Immortal John Hancock, and you take care.